Interesting, interesting. Okay, Osana. Okay, now let's come back to the part three of our video, right? In which this video, now I think I'm going to break down the explanation and the exercise of this topic into two separate videos, okay? Now, for this video, let us take a look at the logic and the graphical representation of different types of elasticity of demand, right? And the relationship with something we call total expenditure, or later on in later chapters, you will see we also call it total revenue, although they're not quite the same, right? Most of the time they're the same, but sometimes they are not the same, right? So for simplicity's sake, let's stick with total expenditure for now. Okay, 好嘛? Now, first of all, what is total expenditure? It's simply P times Q. 係咪咁嘅咋？冇啦，P times Q would be our total expenditure, right? Now, how total expenditure would change when price changes depends entirely on the elasticity of demand. Now, assuming demand and supply doesn't change, okay? 好嘛? Now, depends entirely on elasticity of demand only, okay? 好嘛? Now, let's try to look at different cases in which we have already done so in our lesson. So I'm not going into the details, okay? 好嘛？嗱，先睇 logic，好冇？先睇 logic。We are always talking about when price increase for the following cases, okay? 好嘛？嗱，所以搞清楚啊，我哋 assume 咗 price 係升嘅，好嘛？Now, the logic goes like this. We always start with our first formula, the formula that TE equals to P times Q， 一定係呢條㗎啦，好嘛？ Now, follow me and draw two arrows here. Remember for price, always two arrow. 唔好理你咩情況，總之係 price 嘅，永遠兩個箭嘴，好嘛？ For our purpose, since we are talking about when price increases, now therefore we put two increase. OK， 好嘛？好啦，咩叫 elastic demand 啊？ Elastic demand refers to the situation when the percentage change in Q is larger than the percentage change in price. So in this case, we know according to the law of demand, when price increases, quantity demanded would drop. 好啦，大概係 drop 多啲啊嘛，係嘛？ Faster, higher percentage, right? Now therefore, let's add one more arrow down. 好啦，咁啊簡單啦。Then can we determine how TE change? Yes. Cancel these two out. 我哋夾咗個咩出嚟啊？係嘛？ Now we have one extra down. It means that total expenditure would go down when the price increases. 好啦，嚟多次喎，好嘛？倒轉嚟做會點做啊？ Yes, let's try when it is inelastic demand. The same follows, right? P times Q. 我哋永遠都係 P 乘 Q 呢個開始，好嘛？ And we are talking about increase in price. Therefore, two arrows up. Now, the definition of inelastic demand is when the percentage change in QD more specifically, is smaller than the percentage change in price. In our case, right, of course, when price increases, quantity would drop by the law of demand. So here we drop, but since quantity is dropping by a smaller percentage, therefore we put one arrow. Now let's just cancel them out. We see we have one extra up, therefore total expenditure would go up. 係咁嘅啫，係嘛？原來個 logic 就係咁簡單。We use this formula and use our logic, the arrow logic， 我哋睇幾多個箭嘴 in order to determine how TE would change. OK， 好嘛？ Now, let's do for the extreme cases as well. OK, for perfectly inelastic 先，好嘛？ For perfectly inelastic demand, what does that mean? It means that here, quantity cannot change， 永遠變唔到嘅，好嘛？ So let's try this one. TE equals to P times Q. 好啦，我哋知道啦 ，Q cannot change, right? Now, therefore, these go up. What happens to total expenditure? It would go up by the same percentage. Okay, 好嘛? What about this case? Unitarily elastic demand. It means that the percentage change in QD is exactly the same as the percentage change in price. Therefore, the logic, again, TE equals to P times Q, 係嘛? P goes up by 2. Since it is by the same speed, 係咪啊? Same percentage, therefore we draw 2 arrows down. Law of demand, 係咪？點解一個星期係 law of demand 啦？ Then we cancel them out. We found that there is no extra arrow. What does that mean? It means that total expenditure remains unchanged. Okay, now finally this one. Perfectly elastic demand. It refers to the situation when the change in QD is infinite, 無限咁勁嘅變動，好嘛？ Now for our case, TE equals to P times Q. When P increases, Q would drop infinitely, 無限咁跌，係嘛？ Here drop,係嘛？無限咁多個箭嘴 until 幾時冇得再跌啦？ This actually becomes 0. So what happens to TE? It will drop all the way to how much? 0. 跌到0咯。得唔得？ So this is how we use logic to determine the elasticity of demand, or to determine under different types of elasticity of demand how total expenditure is going to change. Now, let's look at some number example before we come back here to look at the graph. Okay, 好嘛？我哋睇咗啲 number 先。On next page here， 我哋望一望啦。Now we need to determine the price elasticity of demand for the following cases. Okay, 好嘛？ Now you are given for the first 2 columns, given price, given quantity demanded. Okay, of course you can calculate the arc elasticity of demand, no problem. 你係可以咁做嘅， but then you know arc elasticity not exactly the easiest to calculate. 都幾麻煩嘅條式係咪啊？ Is there any other smarter way? Yes. All we need to do is to calculate total expenditure as well. 好嘛？我哋試下啦。8 9 72 72 9 6 54 54 and 30. For this one, 270. Okay, this one 睇下先。6 7 42 4 8 6 48 5 22 right？ something along the line。 OK， something along 你自己計啦，你自己計。唔計下一個啦。must be increasing right？ 嗱，Sir， 我做緊啲咩啊？ Again, TE equals to P times Q. Let's check here. As price increases, 由3蚊去6蚊，6蚊去9蚊。What happens to the total expenditure? We see that total expenditure has also increased. In order to balance this equation, we know that quantity has dropped, but not by a lot in terms of percentage, because then we see we can balance this equation. 好啦 ，Q 喐得慢啲喎。What do we call this? We call this inelastic demand. 明唔明啊？原來呢條式咁用㗎。Let's try this one more time. OK， 又係啦。Here, when P increases, what happens to TE? Let's see. Again, TE equals to P times Q. 永遠都係㗎。Now price increases， 兩個箭嘴記住啊，好嘛 ？While the TE would drop， 咦？點樣 balance 呢條 equation 啊 ？The only way is for quantity to drop more percentage. Okay, the percentage drop should be larger. It balances out this equation. 好啦，我哋望望啦。This part, quantity is moving faster than price. What do we call this? We call this elastic demand. Okay, so boys, very important formula. When you're trying to determine total expenditure, when price increase and quantity decreases, TE equals to P times Q. 非常之重要嘅一條式，一定要識點操作啊，好嗎？ Okay, now let's try 4 more examples to see whether we truly understand. Okay, 好啦，嗱今次俾咗啦，TR 嗱唔使諗咁多啦 ，TR is exactly the same as TE. OK， 好啦，而家仲簡單呢個 TE equals to P times Q. 好啦 now we know that as price increases, what happens to the total expenditure? It decreases. Okay, how to balance this equation? We need quantity to drop more. This is what we call elastic demand. 好啦，隔離嗰個音嚟嘅啫。咩叫 average revenue 啊？ Is exactly the same as price. Now, therefore, we need to also calculate the TE, the total expenditure, right? Let's see. 270. 270 and 270. You see anything funny going on here? Yes. TE equals to P times Q. 好啦 definitely price increases. But what happens to total expenditure? We see that total expenditure didn't change. Therefore, in order to balance this equation, we know that quantity dropped by the same percentage. What do we call this? We call this unitarily elastic demand. 係嘛？完全唔變啊 ！Total expenditure doesn't change at all, right? Of course you can 唔使喎，呢個唔使做係咪啊 ？Of course you can also calculate the arc elasticity, but good luck doing that. 我幫你唔到啊 ，good luck doing that. I don't want to do that with you. OK， 費事啦。好啦，最後兩個嗱 ，these two is a little bit tricky. 原來我哋上面呢個方法快嘅 ，but we are missing one very important thing. OK， 記住啊 ，we always still want to find the P and Q。我哋平時其實應該最正統做法係唔係揾埋 P 同 Q 先 ？So here Q 係嘛 ？How do we find this? Total expenditure equals to P times Q. 10, 10, 10. Now do you see that? As price increases, Q doesn't change. What do we call this? 如果 quantity 係完全喐唔到嘅 ，we call this perfectly inelastic demand, right? So this one, we know it is perfectly inelastic demand. And the next one, let's see. Price. 又係啦 10, 10, 10. You see this time, right? The price always remains the same. 10. 好啦，即係咩意思啊 ？This one 嗱呢個咧好難解啊，所以自己背咗佢算啦，好嘛 ？This is perfectly elastic demand. It's too abstract， 唔解啦，太抽象啦，上堂講過啦，好嘛？片唔再講啦，好嘛 ？Okay, so this is the logic, how we operate the logic of elasticity of demand and the relationship between ED and total expenditure. Okay, now finally, before we end this video, let's look at how we represent different types of elasticity of demand with a graph. Okay, 嚟啦噃。Now, if you recall from our last video, we talk about besides except these extreme cases, we do not do anything funny with the slope, right? So we follow the same logic here. 好啦，既然呢個係 elastic，即係唔需要做任何特別嘢。Okay, we just draw a very normal demand curve. Okay, remind ourselves this is a midpoint. 好啦 since this is elastic, if you remember from our last video or from our lesson, right? Elastic region is the upper region. 上面嗰 part 係 elastic. Okay, so now the trick is we use our hand to cover this part. 我哋揞住下面呢 part 去 then we draw the increase in price in the upper part. Of course, right? Of course, we have Q1 and Q2. Now, do you see price increases? 如果而家啲嘢貴咗，即係使多咗錢，使少咗錢啊 This part, since it is more expensive, we are spending more money for this part, but we are buying fewer of it. 我哋買少咗即係使多定使少咗啊 Of course, we are spending less. Boys, can you see? The minus is much larger than the plus. It means that our total expenditure would drop, which matches our logic, right? Easy. 好嘛，原來咁畫嘅啫。Now, the opposite is also true for the inelastic demand. Okay, 我哋試下啦。Now, again, no funny business. Demand, this is a midpoint. Now, since we are talking about inelastic demand, so we cover the upper portion and draw the increase in price in the lower portion. Of course, we have our Q1 and Q2, of course, right? All right, now let's see. Since we are paying more expensive price, therefore, this part spending more money, while this part spending less money. Do you see the spending more is larger than the spending less? Meaning, net effect, we are spending more, which matches our logic. Okay, 原來係咁畫嘅咋. So you see, right? We don't have to do anything funny with the slope. We just deal with the upper portion and lower portion. Now, when do we need to deal with those slopes, right? When we are dealing with these extreme cases. Let's start with perfectly inelastic demand. 我哋試下呢個啦，好嘛? Now, this one, this time, since it is perfectly inelastic, if you remember, the demand is a vertical line, right? Now, therefore, P1 increases to P2. 你阿 Sir 今次 region 緊唔緊要啊 No, not important, right? Because we are paying more, but at the same time, quantity doesn't change. 而家係比貴咗嘛 It's more expensive, but we are not buying any fewer. Therefore, this whole part is an increase in total expenditure. While next one, unitarily elastic demand, which honestly, I think EAA would not ask you to draw because it's quite difficult to draw a very beautiful one. Now, I try my best, okay? Let's try here. P1 increases to P2. Then we have Q1, Q2. Now, obviously, this part paying more expensive price. This part buying less. Therefore, 係嘛? These two parts, ideally speaking, should be the same. Therefore, TE doesn't change. Obviously, I can't draw them to be the same, right? 我隻手畫條 curve 冇畫得咁靚㗎，係嘛? So that's why I said EAA most likely will not exam on this part. 好啦 finally, let's try this one. 哎呀 Now, perfectly elastic demand. Here, the demand used to be P1. Now, let's say it changes to P2. 好啦，去到 P2 咧會發生咩事啊 You see at P2, QD is exactly 0. So we have no area. Let's say originally, we were buying at Q1. Now it would drop all the way to 0. 完全冇晒. So this part will be a decrease in total expenditure. We are spending less money. In fact, we are not spending money at all. Okay, 得唔得? With all that said, this video, we very quickly summarize the logic and the application of the total expenditure and elasticity of demand. For the next video, we will be talking about all those exercise, those past papers at the back of the page. Okay, 好嘛? Then I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.